Welcome, friends. This is episode 2 in how Baha'u'lláh recreated the Bábí community of Baghdad. And today we're going to start with Baha'u'llah's 2-year journey in Sulaymaniyeh and in Kurdistan in general, on Sargalu and Sulaymaniyeh and several other parts today. But we're going to first start with a prayer.
Ordain for me, O my Lord, and for those who believe in thee, that which is deemed best for us in thine estimation, as set forth in the Mother Book. For within the grasp of thy hand thou holdest the determined measures of all things. Thy goodly gifts are unceasingly showered upon such as cherish thy love, and the wondrous tokens of thy heavenly bounties are amply bestowed on those who recognize thy divine unity. We commit unto thy care whatsoever thou hast destined for us, and implore thee to grant us all the good that thy knowledge embraceth. Protect me, O my Lord, from every evil that thine omniscience perceiveth, inasmuch as there is no power, no strength but in thee, no triumph is forthcoming save from thy presence, and it is thine alone to command. Whatever God hath willed hath been, and that which he hath not willed shall not be. There is no power nor strength except in God, the most exalted, the most mighty. The Bab.
That's very beautiful.
I just wanted to mention that Behzad's mom is on also. She's Nursel, and I think she's coming from Turkey. Is that right, Behzad? Behzad?
No, I'm in the States. I had come to the States about a week ago.
Wow, wonderful. Welcome.
You didn't tell me. Okay.
Wonderful. Welcome from Turkey via the United States.
Thank you.
2 wonderful countries. Can anyone give me a thumbs up? Is my screen sharing?
Yes.
Wonderful. Great. So we're going to start with part 4. Last week, we ended with Baha'u'llah's heartbreak and his departure from Baghdad after all of the miseries that Mirza Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad put him through. And he went to seek solace in solitude. And we're going to talk about that first. Throughout the thousands of years of religious history, manifestations of God have sought solitude, seclusion, or distance from the rest of humanity at some point in their ministry. Moses went out into the desert of Sinai. Buddha sought the wilds of India. Jesus Christ walked the wilderness of Judea. The Prophet Muhammad paced the sun-baked hills of Saudi Arabia. And Baha'u'lláh sought the solitude of the mountains in Iraqi Kurdistan. And all those images are from those places. On the 10th of April, 1854 in the morning, Asiye Khanum and the children, Abdul Baha and Bahiye Khanum, woke like the rest of Baha'u'llah's relatives and companions to find out that he had vanished 1 year and 2 days after arriving in Baghdad. And he walked with a companion, and he walked 250 kilometers northeast, that's 160 miles, and then another 40 kilometers or 25 miles northwest to a mountain called Sargalu. Baha'u'lláh was accompanied by a Muslim attendant named Abul Kazim-i Hamadani, and he gave Abul Kazim some money to act as a merchant and to return to him with provisions. So they walked these 185 miles north of Baghdad to a remote mountain called Sargalu, where Baha'u'lláh lived in a cave. He had now adopted the identity of Darvish Muhammadi Irani, the Iranian dervish Muhammad. And this is Baha'u'llah's kashkul. Dervishes have only one possession, their alms bowl, which they receive money in and they eat in. And this is in the international archives now. Baha'u'lláh would come down from his refuge on the mountain into the town of Sulaymaniyeh in order to acquire food and supplies. And at first, Agha Abul Kazim, who was a Muslim, also came to visit him and bring him provisions. But at some point early on in Baha'u'llah's seclusion, Abul Kazim had to leave him and traveled across the border to Persian Azerbaijan to obtain money and provisions. When he was returning, crossing the border between Persia and Iraq, he was attacked and killed either by highwaymen or frontier patrols. But just before he died, Abul Kazim was able to state his name, that he was originally from Hamadan, and that what he carried had been the property of Darvish Muhammadi Irani, who lived in the uplands of Kurdish Iraq. His last words would make it into a news item that would find its way to Baghdad and to the eyes of Abdul Baha and Mirza Musa while they were at the Iranian embassy. And that's how they would find out where Baha'u'lláh was. But this would not be for 2 years. After the death of Abul Kazim, Baha'u'lláh was left completely alone throughout the vast region of Iraqi Kurdistan. For the first year between April 1854 and sometime in 1855, Baha'u'lláh retired to the wilderness. He spent the first year of his retirement living on a mountain called Sargalu, which is this mountain you see here, which was so remote, it was only visited twice a year by the villagers of the area at planting and harvest times. During his time on Sargalu, Baha'u'lláh was completely isolated. He was a 3-day walk from closest inhabited house. During this time, he survived mostly on rice and milk, which he probably obtained by occasionally making the journey to Sulaymaniyeh, 40 kilometers, 25 miles away, where he would also take the opportunity to visit a public bath. The people of Kurdistan had their own culture and language. They were Sunni, sturdy and belligerent people. And though they shared a border with Persia, they had century-old hostility with the Shia neighbors, whom they considered traitors to Islam. Baha'u'lláh was crudely dressed as a dervish and owned nothing but a change of clothes and his alms bowl, his kashkul. For 2 years, the Kurds knew Baha'u'lláh only as Dervish Muhammad. On Sargalu, Baha'u'lláh lived in solitude, completely undisturbed, at times living in caves in the mountain or a crude stone structure in which the rare peasants who came to the mountain used when the weather was bad. The wild country Baha'u'lláh roamed was a physical manifestation of the spiritual wilderness he found himself in. As he would later tell his beloved cousin Maryam, I roamed the wilderness of resignation, traveling in such wise that in my exile every eye wept sore over me, and all created things shed tears of blood because of my anguish. The birds of the air were my companions, and the beasts of the field my associates. These days in Kurdistan were filled with profound spiritual pain and anguish, but also physical suffering. Baha'u'lláh often went hungry, as he testifies in the Kitab-i-Iqan. There rained tears of anguish, and in my bleeding heart surged an ocean of agonizing pain. Many a night I had no food for sustenance, and many a day my body found no rest. Alone I communed with my spirit, oblivious to the world and all that is therein. A new stage in Baha'u'llah's self-imposed isolation began in 1955. For a full year, Baha'u'lláh had lived deprived of even the most basic of comforts. On his mountain of Sargalu, when a man living in Sulaymaniyeh, Sheikh Ismail, an important man, had a dream of the Prophet Muhammad, directing him to seek out this Darvish Muhammad and bring him food. The Sheikh visited Baha'u'lláh several times, insisting repeatedly that Baha'u'lláh come and live in Sulaymaniyeh, until finally Baha'u'lláh consented. This marked the end of Baha'u'llah's first period of seclusion in Kurdistan and ushered in the second period, a progressive return to society in the Kurdish town of Sulaymaniyeh. When he first established residency in Sulaymaniyeh, Baha'u'lláh was so reserved and silent, the inhabitants had no reason to consider him other than what he said he was, traveling Persian dervish, lodged in the local Taqi, the Sufi theological seminary. But it was not long until everyone in Sulaymaniyeh was amazed at the superhuman mind and capacities of Baha'u'lláh, and it started with a 13th century book, the Futuhat-i Makkiyeh. Soon after Baha'u'llah's arrival in Sulaymaniyeh, a delegation of the most brilliant and distinguished Islamic doctors and students came to visit Baha'u'lláh, and they found him perfectly willing to answer any of their questions. After several interviews, the Muslim clerics asked Baha'u'lláh to expound on obscure passages of the 37-volume Futuhat-i Makkiyeh, also known as the Meccan Revelations, the celebrated 13th century masterpiece of Ibn al-Arabi. Baha'u'lláh had never laid eyes on this immense work, but he agreed to expound upon it if a page was read to him every day. Each day, after a page of the Futuhat-i Makkiyeh was read aloud to Baha'u'lláh, he would answer the cleric's questions, and the assembled scholars were astounded. Baha'u'lláh did not simply clarify obscure mystical passages, but he would interpret Ibn al-Arabi's mind, expound on his doctrine, and explain his intent. At times, Baha'u'lláh would question the validity of some of Ibn al-Arabi's arguments, reframing them with proofs that completely convinced his learned audience. The scholars were so spellbound, amazed at the depth of Baha'u'llah's insight and the breadth of his understanding, that they asked him to do something no one had ever been able to do before. Before I explain what the scholars of Sulaymaniyeh asked Baha'u'lláh to do, I have to provide the right context. For 7 centuries, the greatest achievement of Arabic literature was unanimously considered to be the Qadsiyeh-i Tayyeh, the absolute masterpiece of a 12th century mystic, Ibn Farid, who lived between 1181 and 1234. Qadsiyeh-i Tayyeh was a very long poem of 760 verses, nearly 10 times the length of any other poem of the same style. The poem was also entirely in Arabic, and Baha'u'lláh was a Persian. The poem also had a very specific meter with rhyming couplets. What was extraordinary about the Qadsiyeh Tayyeh was that in itself, it was an entirely new form of literature. It was part poem, part treatise. It was all at once lyrical, dramatic, narrative, and didactic. What the scholars of Sulaymaniyeh asked Baha'u'lláh to do was to reveal a new poem in the exact same rhythm and meter and length as Ibn Farid's original, a feat no one had ever been able to duplicate until Baha'u'lláh. Baha'u'lláh far exceeded their expectations. He dictated the Qadsiyeh-i Varqayeh, the Ode of the Dove, a 2,000-verse poem, nearly 3 times the length of Ibn Farid's work, which was already 10 times the length of the regular poems of that style. He dictated it completely in Arabic and in identical rhyme and meter, but vastly superior in theme to the original poem. With his astounding masterpiece, Baha'u'lláh rewrote grammar rules. Behzad, can you mute Susie's iPad? Sorry, I can't keep talking. Can you
Hold
make me
on.
co-host so I can mute it, or can you make my...
I will mute her. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So it was not only 2,000 verses instead of 760, it also rewrote Arabic grammar rules. It was superior in content, and Baha'u'lláh embedded multiple mystical and theological allusions within each couplet. And imbued the poem with an entirely new messianic theme, to which he would add footnotes, which we still have and which have been translated into English in Baha'i Library online upon his return to Baghdad. In the end, Baha'u'lláh only allowed the people of Sulaymaniyeh to keep 127 out of the 2,000 verses. He estimated that the mystical subject matter was too premature. No one was ready to hear it. These verses were and still continue to be widely circulated among Arabic speakers. Baha'u'llah's live revelation of the extraordinary Ode to the Dove was an astonishing event. After this feat, his fame spread far and wide in Kurdistan. Everyone knew of this wondrous Persian dervish, learned and illiterate Kurds, ulamas, sheikhs, and even princes. Soon, the people of Kurdistan were magnetized by his love, and Baha'u'lláh had won the hearts of 3 regional Sufi leaders, among which the man for whom Baha'u'lláh would later reveal the 4 valleys. Baha'u'lláh left, and this is a valley very, very close to Sulaymaniyeh. Baha'u'lláh left a rich legacy behind when he left Sulaymaniyeh, not just his explanation of the Meccan revelations, not just his Ode to the Dove. He left personal things. He drew up a document that safeguarded the endowment of the mosque's custodianship to his descendants. Baha'u'lláh drew up many such documents for the inhabitants of Sulaymaniyeh during his time there, and these documents were still in the property of the families of Sulaymaniyeh when the historian, hand of the cause, Mr. Hassan Balyuzi, visited Sulaymaniyeh. And the people would never part with them because they said that these documents were a blessing to their family. During the remainder of Baha'u'llah's time in Sulaymaniyeh, he gave discourses, opened new worlds to his reverent listeners with the many epistles that he revealed, resolved the questions that puzzled their minds, and unfolded the inner meaning of obscure passages written by poets, commentators, and theologians, and he reconciled opposing statements in dissertations and treatises. Baha'u'lláh grew so much in their estimation that the people of Sulaymaniyeh began speculating on his station, somehow perhaps knowing in a spiritual sense that he was not a regular person like them. Some believed that he was a man of the unseen, a Sufi term for people who were closer to God than men. Others believed Baha'u'lláh was a master of alchemy or a master of divination, and others called him a pivot of the universe. And some were rightly convinced that he was a prophet of God. Out of respect, the Kurds addressed Baha'u'lláh as Ishan, they, and they revered him more highly than Kaka Ahmad, a Sufi saint of past ages. According to Shoghi Effendi, Kurdistan is the place on this planet where Baha'u'lláh, the supreme manifestation of God, had laid the foundations of his future greatness. After his departure, Sargalu, where Baha'u'lláh had spent the first year of his seclusion, was held to be a sacred place for the people of Sulaymaniyeh. In early 1856, Baha'u'lláh bid farewell to the sheikhs of Sulaymaniyeh, his most passionate and later his most faithful followers. Baha'u'lláh left behind a host of admirers and supporters who bitterly grieved his departure, but he would keep in contact with them, and he would enter their presence, and some would enter his presence in Baghdad and receive momentous tablets from his pen. Baha'u'lláh returned to Baghdad with Sheikh Sultan, a faithful Iraqi Bábí his family had sent to Sulaymaniyeh, showing great discernment. All of the Bábís, most of the Bábís in Baghdad were Persian, including Baha'u'llah's immediate family. But when they found out by reading that newspaper article that Baha'u'lláh was in Iraqi Kurdistan, they made the very wise choice of sending an Iraqi Bábí. And he arrived, and at first he didn't approach Baha'u'lláh. He stayed far. He took a room somewhere in the caravanserai and observed and saw how much the population revered him. And he thought, what if I take him right now and bring him back to Baghdad? They will murder me. So he took his time. And at first, Baha'u'lláh refused to return to Baghdad. Remember, we saw last week that when he left, he had no plans to return. He had made up his mind. But then, even the supreme manifestation of God bends their personal will to God, as Baha'u'lláh explained in the Kitab-i-Iqan, where he gives us an insight into the powerful spiritual forces that guided his decision to end his seclusion. And this is what Baha'u'lláh says. From the mystic source, there came the summons, bidding us return whence we came. Surrendering our will to his, we submitted to his injunction. Baha'u'lláh returned to Baghdad, back to his beloved family, back to the ruins of the devastated Bábí community, which he would now have to recreate. He ended his retirement in Kurdistan in slow, easy stages. Baha'u'lláh returned, having full knowledge of what awaited him, not only in Baghdad, but for the rest of his life. In a sad moment of foretelling, Baha'u'lláh would tell Sheikh Sultan that these were his last days of seclusion. They would be the only days of peace and tranquility left to me, days which will never again fall to my lot. He loved his time in Kurdistan, even though it was painful. He really loved it. And there were no covenant breakers in Kurdistan, only people who loved him. But he left because he was the manifestation of God and he needed to go back to where he was most needed. In fact, when Sheikh Sultan came to Sulaymaniyeh, he brought a lot of letters from Baha'is, including a letter from Mirza Yahya, begging Baha'u'lláh to come back. Can you imagine how much he must have messed up for him, who had wanted Baha'u'lláh to leave, who was overjoyed when he did leave, for him 2 years later to beg him to return? That is what was awaiting Baha'u'lláh, a devastated community. But before leaving his Kurdish friends in Sulaymaniyeh, Baha'u'lláh also gave them his brother's name. And they said if they ever came to Baghdad, they should look for Mirza Musa the Bábí, and they would find him. And his friends never forgot it. Part 5, Baghdad in Baha'u'llah's absence. So, what exactly went down in Baghdad while Baha'u'llah was in Kurdistan? What mischief did Mirza Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad get up to? What did they plot? What did they scheme? And what did they do? First, we're going to start with the Holy Family without Baha'u'llah. So, Asiya Hanum found herself alone with her children, Abdul Baha, 10 years old, Bahiya Hanum, 8 years old, and her 1-year-old baby, Ali Muhammad. Before leaving, Baha'u'llah had offered Mirza Yahya the hospitality of the Holy Family's home, and Mirza Yahya never forgot it. And I believe he had 5 wives. So he and his 5 wives moved in, and they made the Holy Family's life a living hell. They were very difficult about food. They had impossible demands. Plus, Mirza Yahya was very, very paranoid. He was very cynical, and he distrusted everyone. Between 1854 and 1856, we don't know when, the baby, Ali Muhammad, became seriously ill. Consumed by paranoia, Mirza Yahya would not allow a doctor or even a neighbor to come in and help Asiya Hanum. And Ali Muhammad passed away. His death broke Asiya Hanum's heart. But to make matters worse, Mirza Yahya would not allow Ali Muhammad a proper burial. And the youngest child of Baha'u'lláh, the supreme manifestation of God, was given to a stranger to bury, and the family never found out where. Betrayal. While Baha'u'llah's greatness was being unveiled in Kurdistan, back in Baghdad, the situation in the Bábí community was rapidly deteriorating. At first, Mirza Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad were pleased and bolstered about Baha'u'llah's sudden and lengthy absence, and they busily extended the range of their wicked activities. Devoured by paranoia, Mirza Yahya spent most of his time inside the house, shuttered, directing a smear campaign aimed at discrediting Baha'u'llah through letters he handed to Bábís he trusted. Mirza Yahya was also very scattered in his plotting. He managed to convince the very confused 16-year-old Mirza Aqajan, who had just become Baha'u'llah's amanuensis the year before. He convinced Mirza Aqajan to go back to Iran and murder Nasruddin Shah. Of course, Mirza Aqajan chickened out, didn't do it, thank God. Sayyid Muhammad, he was in Karbala, a different city from Baghdad, and he was far from being outdone by Mirza Yahya. He had irrational evil deeds. He was just plotting right and left. So he surrounded himself with this gang of thugs, and he encouraged them to steal. So they snatched turbans off of the heads of wealthy pilgrims. They stole their shoes when they went into the shrines to pray. They stole divans and candles from the shrine of the two imams, and they even robbed drinking cups from public fountains. They're just going nuts, I think. Shame. Mirza Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad forever stained the annals of the faith by dishonoring the Bab in the vilest possible manner. While the Bab left Shiraz in September of 1846, he went to Isfahan for 6 months. And when he was living alone in Isfahan, he couldn't clean the floors himself. He needed to have a woman clean the floors. But in order to have a woman clean the floors, the woman needed to be his legal wife. So it was not a marriage. It was more like an employment contract. And a suitable Bábí woman was chosen. Her name was Fatimeh Hanum. And when the Bab was martyred, Fatimeh Hanum's status in the Bábí community was quite high, because even though she was just a wife on paper, not a wife like Khadija Begum was, she was still a wife, even if it was a technicality. So her family had sent her to Baghdad, and she didn't say no. She could have, but Mirza Yahya married her. And then when he married her, his 5 wives decided that she was too much of a threat because of her association with the Bab. So they kicked her out of his house. And then a month later, Mirza Yahya gave her to Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani in marriage. So they both married her. And when Baha'u'llah learned of this, it just broke his heart into a million pieces. His grief knew no bounds when he found out about the stain on the name of the Bab. He called it the dishonor inflicted on the primal point, and stated that the act had truly overwhelmed all lands with sorrow, meaning also the worlds of God were just engulfed in sorrow when that happened. In the 2 years that Baha'u'llah was living in seclusion in Kurdistan, 25 Bábís declared themselves the promised one foretold by the Bab. The Bábís were so humiliated by the behavior of Mirza Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad's followers that the Bábís dared not appear in public, because they were spat on, they were insulted, they were disrespected from the outside by the Baghdad community, who just thought that they were just a bunch of thugs with no education and no beliefs. And then they were disrespected from the inside because of what Sayyid Muhammad and Mirza Yahya had done to the second wife of the Bab. They were berated, they were insulted. By late 1855, the situation was so tragic, then that's when Mirza Yahya wrote that letter asking Baha'u'llah to return. Excuse me. So part 6, opposition in Baghdad. Because the remainder of the talk after this section is going to be 100% positive. It's going to be all how Baha'u'lláh recreated the Bábí community, how his revelation changed people's hearts and beings and souls, and he brought so much joy to people, and how his person was such a powerful presence that people were transformed just by entering his presence, and how important the most great house was. It's going to be wonderful, and it's going to end with his declaration in the Garden of Rizwan, so it's all going to be really positive. But what I want you to understand is that in the middle of all that positivity, Baha'u'lláh had opposition from 2 sides during that time. First, 2 years after he returns, there's going to be one period of opposition. And then the second period of opposition is going to be before the declaration in the Garden of Rizwan. So I want you to keep in mind that he has opposition during those times, but I decided to separate them to make a more effective talk. So this is the first period of opposition that lasts between 1860 and 1861. It's 9 months of continuous opposition. And as Baha'u'llah's prestige grew in Baghdad, when he returned to Baghdad over the first 2 years, his actions and his person, he rose so much in the esteem of the people of Baghdad that officials in the government and very wealthy Persians, that the jealousy of the envious and dark-hearted people, two in particular, Sheikh Abdul Hussein, a cunning and troublemaking, disgraced Persian priest, and Mirza Buzurg Khani Razvini, the new Persian consul, who arrived in Baghdad in July 1860, who was not only a dishonorable and insincere man, but a heavy drinker. Sheikh Abdul Hussein and Mirza Buzurg Khani Razvini absolutely hated Baha'u'lláh. And they hated Bábí so much. First, what they did, this is a series of all of their techniques to try to destroy Baha'u'lláh. The first technique was really weird. It's extradition. They tried to get everybody extradited back to Iran, and that didn't work. So then they tried a second very weird strategy of strange dreams. They began widely and systematically spreading interpretations of very weird dreams that painted the Bab and the Babis in a negative light. And weird dreams like a cup of blood is spilled by somebody who's riding a horse, and Baha'u'lláh is in a mosque, and he's surrounded by verses of the Quran that are written in Latin alphabet instead of Arabic. But no one cared. No one cared. So that strategy failed. Then they hired an assassin to kill Baha'u'lláh, who failed on 2 occasions, including one occasion when he tried to kill Baha'u'lláh in the bazaar and jumped out at him and dropped his pistol on the floor. And Baha'u'lláh said to Mirza Musa, can you please pick up this man's gun and accompany him home? So that failed. So in the end, they were like, great. They decided to put an extreme amount of pressure on the Persian government. And they forcibly obtained from the Persian government, because they were really tired of getting their letters. They said, fine. You have unilateral authority to deal with the Babis however you want. So they used this unilateral authority, and they gathered all the ulamas, and they declared a holy war. Except one ulama who's very fair-minded was like, I can't sign this. He was the most important one too. And he said, I can't sign this. Can't sign this. So they couldn't declare holy war. So that failed. Then one night, independent of these 2 nut jobs, an armed mob descended on the Most Great House to murder Baha'u'lláh as a massive group of just mobs. So then what Baha'u'lláh did was he just flung open the doors of the Most Great House and invited them in and served them probably the most Persian thing that exists. It's called rosewater sherbet. It's basically not ice cream. It's like a rose syrup. So they're just there, the mob trying to kill Baha'u'lláh. They're just hanging out in the Most Great House, drinking rosewater syrup and just having a wonderful time. They're deliriously happy by Baha'u'llah's hospitality. And then they left yelling in the street and raising their arms and saying, "May God curse your enemies." So that didn't work. This is the second period of opposition that is right before the second exile of Baha'u'lláh and the declaration of Baha'u'lláh in the Garden of Rizwan. This is a different kind of opposition. It is also an external opposition to the faith. They are not Baha'is, but this is more at a government level. And the people, these are just all the players who are involved. So Mirza Buzurg Khan, so first of all, let me just start with this slide here. On the left, you have Nasruddin Shah, the Shah of Persia. On the right, you have Sultan Abdul Aziz, who is the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and Iraq was in the Ottoman Empire. So these are the leaders of the two countries. And Baha'u'lláh is going to have his second exile, his third exile, his fourth exile. All of those are going to be in the gigantic Ottoman Empire that basically ate up all of the Middle East and Central Asia. Like it went from Iraq to Turkey to Syria to Egypt to what we now know as Israel, and like it was huge. So Baha'u'lláh lived the rest of his life from 1853 onwards in the Ottoman Empire. These two sovereigns started getting flooded with false and alarming reports misrepresenting Baha'u'lláh as an active hostile enemy and constantly harassed to remove him from Baghdad. And who did this? These two people, wonderful people here. The Persian foreign minister in Baghdad, Mirza Said Khan. So he is the Persian foreign minister in Baghdad, so in the Ottoman Empire, Mirza Said Khan. And the Persian ambassador in Istanbul, Mirza Hussein Khan. Together, they worked to put pressures on the authorities in Istanbul to exile Baha'u'lláh there, saying that the Bábís were a misguided and detestable sect. They accused Baha'u'lláh of secretly corrupting and misleading foolish persons and ignorant weaklings. And then they started making stuff up. They said that he was physically too close to Persia, and so the holy shrines were in danger. And Persia, because it was Shia, and he was so close because he was right on the border, it was super dangerous for Baha'u'lláh to be there. He had to be as far away as possible. Please just get him to Istanbul. That is why in March 1863, Baha'u'lláh was undeservedly, unfairly, unjustly exiled a second time to Istanbul. It was them. It was their fault. Now, my father, I gave this presentation at some point in the past, and my father made a very important remark. He remarked that the enemies of Baha'u'lláh came in 4 pairs of evil duos. So this is all my dad, and I made the illustrations, but this is my father's idea. So the first and only inner evil duo of Baha'u'llah's enemies is formed by Bábís, Mirza Yahya, the arch-breaker of the covenant of the Bab, and Sayyid Muhammadi Esfahani, the antichrist of the Bábí revelation. These are terms given by Shoghi Effendi in God Passes By. Now, the rest of the 3 evil duos are all external enemies of the faith. We have Sheikh Abdul Hussein, the disgraced Persian cleric, and Mirza Buzurg Khan, the Persian consul to Baghdad, the heavy drinker. Then we have the Persian foreign minister in Baghdad, Mirza Said Khan, and his BFF, the Persian ambassador in Istanbul, Mirza Hussein Khan. And lastly, we have the Shah of Iran, Nasruddin Shah, and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Abdul Aziz. That is it for today. Next week we see each other, we're going to look at Baha'u'llah's return to Baghdad. And it's going to be really wonderful, really, really wonderful. So now I'm going to stop my screen share. And if anybody has any questions, I would love to have a little discussion about this with you. Hope you enjoyed it, by the way.
Very interesting. Thank you. I do have one question. When Baha'u'lláh came back to Baghdad, did he live in this? Did he still share a house with his brother?
Oh, okay. That's a really good point. That's a very good point. I kind of I cut out a lot of details because otherwise this would be like a 10-hour talk. But what happened was this. Mirza Yahya lived in the first house that Baha'u'lláh had in Old Baghdad with his 5 wives and Asiya Khanum and the children. And he made their lives hell. And we don't know how long that lasted. But then Mirza Musa rented an amazing, amazing, amazing house. This house that we know as the Most Great House. And when he rented the Most Great House, the first thing he did was he went to Asiya Khanum and said, come with the children and live with me. And when Baha'u'lláh returned to Baghdad, the first place he set foot in was the Most Great House.
Okay, thank you. Somehow it's hard for us as Baha'is to understand how young all these people were. You had mentioned last time that Mirza Yahya was 19.
Yeah.
You mentioned
early
that
bloomer in his
but you also mentioned Mirza Khajan, the secretary, was also what, 15, 17?
Yeah. Does anyone have a calculator? Baha'u'lláh was how old? Baha'u'lláh was born in 1817 and this is 1856. How old is he now? I'm not good
40,
at
39.
39. See, so he's not that, he's only 8 years older than the Bab was when the Bab was martyred. So he is also young. And one of the things that I think we don't dwell enough on is that all of these people, Baha'u'lláh, the Bab, Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi, were perfect. They were physically perfect, and they had these perfect minds. And no, Shoghi Effendi was infallible also, but they were also the most beautiful specimens of Persian men that have ever existed. And that is, they were, well, look at the picture of Abdul Baha when he's young. Look at his hands, look at his face. He's 24, but his face is just radiant, you know? And so Baha'u'lláh at that time was in his 30s. He probably may not even have had any gray hairs. He was probably had a full head of black hair. And he was very, 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 very handsome. I'm not saying that beauty is important, but what I'm saying is when someone has the mystical power, Shoghi Effendi, Amatul Baha says something in The Priceless Pearl that I think is very important. She said that anybody who's at the head of the faith, so Baha'u'lláh, during his ministry, Abdul Baha when he was the center of the covenant, Shoghi Effendi when he was the guardian, whoever is at the center, they have these forces around them that are the forces of the covenant that are just around them. And what that does, it's like a negative test, you know, it's like for people who are faithful and loving and steadfast, they are elevated, they are better in that environment. And for people who are jealous and hateful and egotistical, the 7 deadly sins, they just wither in that environment. So when Baha'u'lláh came back, he's 30 something, 38, 39 years old, and he is so kind and so loving and so knowledgeable. And he has so much spiritual power because he is receiving revelation. He reveals, we forget that he reveals the Kitab-i-Iqan 2 years before he declares his mission. So he is receiving the revelation. We forget that the hidden words, the Kitab-i-Iqan, gems of divine mysteries, the 4 valleys, the 7 valleys were all revealed before the Garden of Rizwan, before he was officially him whom God shall make manifest. But what this shows us is that he was receiving divine revelation the entire time that he was in Kurdistan, the entire time that he was traveling over every moment and every second since 15th of October, 1852 in the Siyat-Shal, when he received the Maid of Heaven. He's been receiving these intimations from God directly. He is the manifestation of God. And so obviously being around him would be transformative. And that's the subject of this talk, is how And the reason why it's how Baha'u'lláh recreated the Bábí community of Baghdad and not how Baha'u'lláh recreated the Bábí community of Istanbul and Edirne and Akka is because after Baghdad, Baha'u'lláh will never be social again, ever. He will never walk the streets. He will never make friends. He will never kiss old ladies on the cheek. He will never go to cafes. He will never invite people to his home. He will never talk to non-Baha'is. And as he gets older, as he gets closer to his essential, he won't even talk to Baha'is. Why? We saw this in the first lecture last week, because the exile to Baghdad was fair, justified, and Baha'u'lláh chose his destination. The second one was a product of manipulation from those two evil duos. The third one was also unfair, and the fourth one was also unfair. So Baghdad is a very special time in Baha'u'llah's life. He is actually going to be doing community building. Himself, he's going to do that.
Merci. Thank you, sweetie. Really, really good. Looking forward to the next one.
Yep. So,
Okay.
friends, yes, any other questions?
I just had a quick question. You mentioned in the last talk about how God had to basically convince Baha'u'lláh to come back.
Mhm.
But could you go into that just a little bit?
Yeah. Baha'u'lláh left because his heart was so broken. He got to the point where he was reciting, "Is there any remover of difficulties 1,000 times a day?" That's no way to live. His heart was totally broken. He was running out in the middle of the courtyard in the middle of the night with his nightcap still on. He was torn. He was suffering too much. And like I explained earlier in this talk, all the manifestations of God at one point or another retired from civilization because humanity was just too much. And the weight that they were carrying as manifestations of God, they needed to seclude. And when God left, he said, actually, if you give me just 1 second, I want to say his exact words because I don't want to paraphrase something that important. Our withdrawal contemplated no return, and our separation hoped for no reunion. Baha'u'lláh quoted in God Passes By. So what happens is he has 2 years in Sulaymaniyeh. And when Sheikh Sultan comes and says, okay, I have a bunch of letters here that say that it's time for you to go home. And Baha'u'lláh said, no. And he went back and he said, from the mystic source, there came the summons bidding us to return whence we came. The summons and the mystic source is God. So God told us to go back where we came. Surrendering our will to his, we submitted to his injunction. This is one of the cases, one of the rare cases where a manifestation of God will admit that God changed their mind. I don't know if there is another example of this. Baha'u'lláh had made his mind up. He was happy in Kurdistan. He could see himself there for the rest of his life. But no, after he had said no to Sheikh Sultan, he went back to his theological seminary with all his friends, where he'd been for a whole year. And somehow something mystical happened where God told him, you must go back. And Baha'u'lláh said, okay. And he knew that he would be in for suffering. He knew that Mirza Yahya would try to kill him by poisoning him. He knew everything in most great prison, the death of his son, all of this. He knew. He's a manifestation of God. You think these were surprises to him? Sulaymaniyeh was awesome. The Kurds sound like solid people.
Thank you.
Jamie, you're mute. You unmute yourself.
There's a button if you like move either your finger or your mouse to the top or the bottom. You can mute and unmute yourself.
Who's trying to unmute?
Yeah, I don't know her name. It says iPad.
Jamila.
Maybe
I
someone
can't-
can call her on the phone and ask her what her question is. Oh, there you go.
My question was, will the next session be on Baha'u'lláh in Baghdad?
Yes.
And who are some of your sources?
Let me answer that for you right now.
Tahizadeh, Baluzi, The Guardian, God Passes
I
By.
have a lot of papers from scholars also. So let me just tell you who are my sources. I'm going to start with Kurdistan, and then I'm going to go to Baghdad. Okay, so with Kurdistan, all of those things that you may not have heard before, like the diet of Abdul Baha, what he ate, that he went there for the public bath, all of those, they come from a paper that was written by Adib Masumian. Hold on. Adib Bijan Masumian, Baha'u'llah's Seclusion in Kurdistan, published in Deepen magazine. I have God Passes By, The Dawnbreakers, Adib Taherzadeh, Balyuzi, also again the Kurdistan paper, Balyuzi. These are very classic sources. Then what else? I have Wikipedia articles on the things that I didn't know, like Ibn Arabi and Al-Futuhati Makkiyeh, because when I write, I like to add details that show that I've done the research. So I go to Wikipedia a lot to find out who these old guys are and what these old books are about, you know? Then there's like a lot of other interesting things. Like there's a paper on the Ode of the Nightingale. That's a paper that was presented to the Irfan Colloquia. I also quote directly from the works. And then let's see and then those are mostly my sources for what do you call it, for Kurdistan. Then for I use a Lady Bloomfield from The Chosen Highway, all of the above sources for Baghdad as well. I'm just going to read you the ones that are a little bit unusual. And of course, everything I write is either published in book form or it's published as a paper. Those are my sources. It's just that I go very deep and I look at a lot of scholarly articles. You know, like for one of the sections in Baghdad, I went to this woman who wrote this scholarly article on this one poem, you know. But mostly, yeah, for example, one of my main sources for the Baghdad era is Ustad Muhammad Ali Salmani, the barber, My Memories of Baha'u'lláh. And Shoghi Effendi, God Passes By, is like my source for almost every story. But then I also go into the footnotes of certain things, like the footnotes of the Rashi Amma gave me a lot of information for one of my talks. And then Ali Akbar Furatan, Memories of Baha'u'lláh. I could go on, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in the chat where you can find all my sources. They're at the bottom of every story. And you can go and read all of the details that I left out in those two links, because I left out a lot of details. So there you go. Those two will take you to the stories that I said today. And they're both like 30 pages long. So I cut a lot.
Thank you, Violetta. Violetta, I wanted to ask you, did you ever contact or get a hold of the papers of Amin Banani, who also walked the mountains of Sulaymaniyeh, trying to get stories?
No, I didn't.
His widow, Sheila Banani, is 94 and still very active, if you can get a hold of her.
I haven't had a lot of luck contacting people that don't know me. People, they don't respond. So I just don't do that anymore.
Okay.
I don't contact scholars. I don't contact authors. I just, if I can't find it, I just keep looking and I get creative.
Very good.
Yeah, I don't like rejection, especially coming from authors, and people are all like, I'm too busy. I'm like, yeah, well, you know what? In my 3 years of Baha'i research, I've never heard Baha'u'lláh say I was too busy. Or Abdul Baha or The Guardian, and they were busier than you.
Well, I'm glad you weren't too busy to come and give us this talk.
I am never too busy to talk about Baha'u'lláh.
Thank you.
It is an honor to be with you, and it's an honor to talk about this. I think this is such an important part of Baha'u'llah's history, It's when Baha'u'lláh was most social in his life. We can learn so much from it. You're going to understand what I mean when we actually get to the point of the talk, but it's very important for me to set the stage. Otherwise, it makes no sense. If I just start off with how Baha'u'lláh recreated the Bábí community, you're not going to appreciate how destroyed it was. I had to do this, you know?
Before we close, I did want to mention that you had very kindly agreed to skip one session.
Mhm.
Is that correct?
Yeah, but we're gonna skip one session, and the final session will be in early December.
Right. So because of Thanksgiving in the United States, and many people are going to be out with family, Violetta's kindly agreed to skip the 25th, I think it is. And the next one then will be December 2nd. So we'll have the 18th as usual, and then December 2nd. Okay,
Sounds
everybody
good.
got that? Same link, same everything. And
Same link,
time.
same everything. Now,
Yeah.
I have one request from Behzad. Please find a way in the settings on Chrome and on the actual web to remove that ding when people join. It drives me insane.
I did it after the last ding. I realized, and
But then when somebody joined today, there was another ding, and my brain was like,
oh, after that, I stopped it.
okay, you're awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey, I can vouch for that. He is awesome.
He is great. I know. It's so funny how sometimes even just exchanging a couple of emails with someone, you get a real sense for who they are. All right, I'm going to stop chit-chatting now because I can go kind of loopy after a long talk. I'm going to let you guys enjoy your evening, your afternoon. I will see you next week. And then on December 2nd, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to speak about this. I love you all. And I'm going to put my email in the chat if you want to email me questions. Yeah, that's my email.
That would be perfect. Thank you.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Violetta?
Yes, Dad.
Can you remind people that you have a channel there where you put this recording?
Yeah, let me put you the channel here as well. Maybe if you could please share this channel with your friends when you are what am I doing? Where's my channel? I can't remember where my channel is.
Is this the YouTube channel that you shared with us?
Yeah. Can you send that out when you send out the thing for the next one?
I can send it out to the one or two people here where I've got contacts. I don't have
feel free to
contacts
post it
for
on
everyone.
Facebook also, you know?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. All right.
All
So
right.
if you could send that out, that would be great. All right. Well, have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Violetta. You take
Bye.
care. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, Jamie John.